Women want men to be in provide mode. But when we criticize, which is a form of emasculation, a man will retract from providing to protect. And if it's a direct attack, like on your character, you're just like your father. Now he's protecting himself. And that's what brings out the worst in men, when they're protecting themselves, because it overrides their compelling desire to protect others. They're the smallest version of themselves, and they're protecting themselves. And they could shut down, right? They could withdraw, or they could attack. And women cause men to attack, and then we think that's who men are. Women cause men to withdraw, and we think, oh, you ghosted me, right? We have all these accusations after we've caused it.
There is a quiet shift happening beneath the noise of social media, dating apps, and cultural debates. And most people are missing it because they are still arguing about the surface details instead of paying attention to the underlying movement. This is not a loud revolution. It is not announced with banners or slogans, and it is not coordinated in chat rooms or secret meetings. It is something far more powerful than that. It is a collective decision made quietly, individually, and without negotiation. Men are no longer participating in systems that no longer serve them, and the consequences of that decision are only beginning to ripple outward. If you stay until the end of this video, you will understand why what we are seeing now is not a temporary trend, not a phase, and not something that can simply be reversed with a few viral talking points. And before we go any further, if you find value in content like this, take a moment to like the video, share it, subscribe to the channel, and click the notification bell, and select all so you get every single Angry Guy video the moment we release it. That support helps this channel continue to speak honestly about things most people are afraid to address. If you are serious about protecting yourself financially and building something real in an unstable world, make sure you check out Angry's Crypto Academy, which is linked in the description of this video. The Academy walks you through how to buy, sell, and trade crypto responsibly, how to protect your assets, and how to think long-term instead of chasing hype. Go check it out after this video, or pause right now and open it in a new tab. And if you enjoy these Angry Guy videos and want to show direct support, you can buy me a Red Bull using the link in the description. It helps keep the lights on and the message moving forward. Now let us talk about what is actually happening. Not the version filtered through headlines, not the version softened for comfort, but the version playing out in real time across restaurants, dating apps, and everyday interactions. What we are seeing right now is not men becoming bitter, angry, or hostile. What we are seeing is men becoming observant, selective, and finally willing to walk away without apology. For decades, there was an unspoken expectation built into dating culture that men would pay, men would pursue, men would absorb the cost, and men would accept the risk without complaint. That expectation survived multiple generations because men were told that this was simply the price of companionship, connection, and intimacy. But something changed. Not overnight, but slowly, and then all at once, men started comparing effort to outcome, cost to benefit, and intention to reality. And once that comparison was made honestly, the illusion could not survive. Stories are now emerging of men going on dates where the bill climbs into the hundreds or even thousands, not because of shared experience or mutual enjoyment, but because the date itself was treated as a transaction with only one expected payer. In many of these cases, it became clear early on that there was no genuine interest, no curiosity, and no intention beyond consumption. For years, this behavior went unchallenged because men were conditioned to tolerate it, to feel guilty for questioning it, and to accept shame if they objected. That conditioning no longer works. What happens now is simple and revealing. Men pay for what they ordered, they stand up and they leave. No shouting, no argument, no public scene. Just a quiet exit. And when that happens, reality steps in without negotiation. Restaurants expect payment, staff follow protocol, consequences are no longer absorbed by someone else. This is not cruelty. This is accountability returning to a space where it had been absent. What makes this moment so significant is not the individual incidents themselves, but the emotional reaction to them. There is genuine shock that the safety net is gone. There is disbelief that the old assumptions no longer hold. And there is growing frustration that guilt and social pressure are no longer effective tools. Men are not arguing anymore, they are opting out. This did not come from nowhere. It is the result of decades of messaging that told men they were optional, replaceable, and suspect by default. Boys grew up hearing that their instincts were dangerous, their presence was intrusive, and their masculinity was something to be corrected rather than understood. At the same time, they were still expected to provide, protect, and pay without hesitation. That contradiction can only last so long before people stop participating in it. Men listened. That is the part that rarely gets acknowledged. When told not to approach, they stopped approaching. When told their attention was unwanted, they withdrew it. When told their effort was unappreciated, they redirected it elsewhere. This was not done out of spite, but out of self preservation. Silence replaced debate, distance replaced negotiation. What many men discovered during that withdrawal was unexpected. Being alone did not feel like failure, it felt like relief. Without constant emotional labor, without financial pressure tied to approval, and without the expectation to perform endlessly for diminishing returns, life became quieter and more manageable. Men began sleeping better. They focused on health, hobbies, work, learning, and personal interests. They found satisfaction in mastery rather than validation. Solitude stopped feeling like a punishment and started feeling like stability. This shift is often misunderstood as men refusing responsibility, but the opposite is true. Men are choosing responsibility for themselves rather than responsibility for systems that treat them as disposable resources. They are no longer willing to be the buffer between comfort and consequence for people who openly state they do not need them. That boundary is firm and it is not angry. At the same time, the economic landscape has changed. Living costs have increased, job security has decreased, and the margin for error has narrowed. In that environment, transactional dating becomes far more visible and far less sustainable. When resources are limited, people start paying closer attention to where those resources go. Men are not immune to financial reality, and they are no longer willing to ignore it for social approval. And social media amplified these dynamics by making behavior observable at scale. Patterns that once seemed isolated became undeniable when shared thousands of times. Men did not need ideology to convince them, they needed evidence. Once they saw consistent outcomes, trust shifted away from promises and toward experience. Observable reality replaced narrative. Another important element of this shift is the erosion of informal protection. For a long time, men acted as a shield between harsh consequences and social expectations. They smoothed over mistakes, absorbed costs, and stepped in when things went wrong. That role was rarely acknowledged, but it was deeply embedded. Now that shield has been lowered, not in anger, but in exhaustion. What we are seeing on platforms like TikTok is the early stage of adjustment to that change. Expressions of frustration, confusion, and disbelief are not about dating alone. They are about the sudden absence of a structure that quietly supported daily life. When that structure disappears, people are forced to confront systems as they actually are, not as they assume them to be. Men did not leave to punish anyone, they left to survive. And survival, once learned, becomes preference. Once someone builds a life around peace, autonomy, and predictability, it becomes very difficult to convince them to re enter chaos voluntarily. The cost is now visible, and visibility changes behavior permanently. There is also a deeper psychological shift happening. Men are no longer seeking permission to define fulfillment. They are no longer outsourcing meaning to external approval. They are building lives that make sense to them, not lives designed to meet someone else's expectations. That internal alignment is powerful, and it is not easily disrupted by shame or nostalgia. It is important to understand that this is not about hostility or resentment. It is about alignment. Men are aligning their actions with their experiences. When effort does not produce mutual benefit, effort is withdrawn. That is not cruelty, that is logic. The most misunderstood part of this entire shift is the idea that men will eventually return once conditions improve or messaging changes. That assumption misunderstands what has been learned. Once someone sees a system clearly, they cannot unsee it. Once peace becomes the baseline, chaos feels unnecessary. Once self sufficiency is established, dependency feels like risk. Men have also learned something else during this time. They have learned that attention is currency, time is currency, energy is currency. Tough times are here. The 9 to 5 is history, and the creator economy is taking over. Join Angry's Creator Academy to learn how to build a thriving online business from scratch with minimal investment. Ditch the daily grind and flourish while others falter. Plus, sign up now and get our online business blueprint free. The Academy is linked in the description below. Go check it out now. And they are no longer spending it without return. This does not mean every interaction is transactional. It means transactions are no longer hidden behind romantic language. This recalibration is not dramatic, it is quiet. It happens one decision at a time, one declined date, one ignored message, one evening spent improving life instead of chasing approval. Over time, those decisions compound. And when they compound across millions of individuals, culture changes. The narrative that men are disappearing is inaccurate. Men are still here. They are simply no longer available on demand. They are no longer volunteering for roles that come with obligation but no appreciation. They are no longer stepping into spaces where the rules are undefined but the penalties are severe. As systems adjust, there will be discomfort. Any shift in balance creates friction. But friction does not mean failure, it means recalibration. What comes next will depend on whether accountability replaces entitlement, whether mutual respect replaces assumption, and whether reality is acknowledged instead of denied. For now, men are choosing peace. They are choosing autonomy. They are choosing clarity over confusion. And once those choices are made, they are rarely reversed. This is only the beginning of the conversation, not the end of it. The implications extend far beyond dating into economics, social structures, and long term cultural stability. Understanding the shift is essential for anyone trying to navigate the future with eyes open rather than closed. When people hear that men are choosing peace, many immediately assume that this peace is fragile or temporary, as if it is something men will eventually grow tired of and abandon. That assumption reveals a misunderstanding of what this peace actually is. This is not escapism, this is not avoidance. This is the result of men finally aligning their daily lives with their internal values. Peace, in this context, is structure, predictability, and control over one's time and energy. It is waking up without dread, moving through the day without constant negotiation, and going to sleep without feeling depleted. Once that baseline is established, it becomes the standard, not the exception. For years, men were told that sacrifice was proof of virtue, that endurance was love, and that silence was maturity. They were expected to absorb frustration without recognition and to keep giving even when the return diminished to nothing. What changed is not men's capacity to give, but their willingness to do so without reciprocity. Reciprocity does not mean entitlement to affection. It means mutual effort, mutual respect, and shared responsibility for outcomes. When those elements disappear, men no longer interpret withdrawal as selfishness. They interpret it as self respect. There's a tendency to frame the shift as men being afraid of commitment or intimacy, but that framing collapses under scrutiny. Commitment requires trust, and trust requires consistent behavior over time. What men observed was not consistency, but volatility. Rules that change depending on mood, context, or audience, expectations that expanded without limit while accountability remained selective. Over time, men learned that stability could not be built on constantly shifting ground. Walking away was not fear, it was adaptation. Another important element of this shift is the role of observation without intervention. Men stopped trying to fix outcomes that were not theirs to fix. They stopped stepping in to smooth over situations they did not create. This withdrawal exposed something uncomfortable, but undeniable. Many systems relied heavily on men absorbing friction behind the scenes. When that absorption stopped, the friction became visible. The result was not immediate collapse, but increasing strain, confusion, and frustration. The expectation that someone else would step in quietly no longer matched reality. This is where the discussion often turns emotional because it forces a confrontation with dependency that was never openly acknowledged. For decades, independence was celebrated rhetorically while reliance persisted practically. Men provided stability while being told they were unnecessary. That contradiction was sustainable only as long as men continued to play their role silently. Once they stopped, the contradiction surfaced, and the response to that exposure has largely been denial rather than reflection. Men are not returning because the conditions that led them to leave have not meaningfully changed. Apologies are not enough if behavior remains the same. Promises are irrelevant without follow through. Men are watching actions now, not listening to explanations. That shift from narrative to pattern recognition is one of the most important developments of this era. Once people trust patterns over words, persuasion loses its power. There is also a generational component to this shift. Younger men grew up watching the consequences faced by older men. They saw the cost of commitment without protection, the risk of responsibility without authority, and the aftermath of systems that offered no safety net in return. Instead of repeating those paths out of obligation, they chose alternatives. They optimized for resilience rather than approval. They invested in skills, financial literacy, and personal development. They learned how to entertain themselves, how to build routines, and how to meet their own needs. That competence reduces desperation, and desperation is what systems often rely on to maintain participation. As men built these self sufficient lives, something else became clear. The constant noise of validation seeking was exhausting. Stepping away from it felt like stepping out of static into silence. That silence was initially unfamiliar, but it quickly became restorative. In that space, men reconnected with interests that had nothing to do with impressing anyone. Games, fitness, learning, creativity, and problem solving became ends in themselves. Fulfillment shifted inward. This inward shift is often misunderstood as isolation, but isolation is imposed. Solitude is chosen. Men are not cut off from the world. They are selective about how they engage with it. They maintain friendships that are reciprocal. They participate in communities built around shared interests rather than constant emotional negotiation. They enjoy companionship without obligation and distance without guilt. This balance is intentional, not accidental. Attempts to shame men back into participation fail because shame no longer has leverage. Shame requires agreement with the standards being enforced. Men no longer agree. When someone does not accept the premise, the tactic loses effectiveness. Guilt functions the same way. It only works when the person believes they owe something. Men have concluded that they do not owe access to their time, money, or attention simply for existing. Another reason this shift feels so disruptive is that it challenges long standing assumptions about gender dynamics. The idea that men will always step in, always pay, always pursue, and always tolerate was treated as a constant rather than a choice. When choices change, systems built on assumptions destabilize. That destabilization is not malicious, it is inevitable. Economic pressure accelerates these changes. When resources tighten, inefficiencies are exposed. Men are no longer subsidizing experiences that provide no return. They are no longer financing lifestyles that do not include them. This is not punishment, it is prioritization. In a world where security is uncertain, people protect what they have. Men are doing exactly that. It is also worth noting that this shift has nothing to do with hatred or resentment. Hatred requires emotional investment. Indifference does not. What we are seeing is indifference replacing engagement. Men are not arguing. They are not campaigning. They are not trying to convince anyone of anything. They are simply choosing differently. That quiet disengagement is far more powerful than confrontation because it does not invite debate. When people say this is just a phase, they overlook how deeply these habits are forming. Once someone builds a routine around autonomy, that routine becomes identity. Identity is not easily surrendered. Men are not waiting to be invited back. They are not hoping for permission. They are not looking for reassurance. They are busy building lives that work for them. There is also a psychological relief that comes from exiting adversarial dynamics. When every interaction feels like a test, a negotiation, or a potential liability, the nervous system remains on edge. Removing oneself from those dynamics allows the body to relax. Stress decreases, focus improves. Over time, that physiological change reinforces the decision to stay away. Peace becomes embodied, not just conceptual. This is why attempts to lure men back with surface level incentives fail. Occasional validation cannot compete with sustained calm. Promises of excitement cannot outweigh predictable stability. Men are no longer chasing peaks, they are protecting baselines. That is a mature shift, not a cynical one. The broader cultural implication of this shift is still unfolding. When large numbers of people disengage from traditional roles, those roles lose meaning. New structures emerge, but only after a period of uncertainty. We are in that period now. The discomfort many feel is not a sign of collapse, it is a sign of transition. And men are not rejecting connection, they are rejecting imbalance. They are not avoiding responsibility, they are rejecting unreciprocated obligation. They are not opting out of society, they are opting out of narratives that no longer align with observable reality. What happens next depends on whether systems adapt or double down. Adaptation requires honesty. It requires acknowledging contributions that were taken for granted. It requires redefining relationships as partnerships rather than transactions. Doubling down leads to further disengagement because pressure without incentive only accelerates withdrawal. And men have already shown their response to pressure. They leave, not loudly, not dramatically, but decisively. Once gone, they rarely return to the same conditions. That lesson is being learned in real time, one interaction at a time. As this conversation continues, it is important to separate emotion from analysis. Feeling unsettled does not mean something is wrong, it means something is changing. Change is uncomfortable by nature, but ignoring it does not reverse it. Understanding it is the first step toward navigating it effectively. Men are no longer the silent foundation holding everything up without recognition. They are visible now, not because they are demanding attention, but because their absence reveals what was always there. And that absence is not a threat, it is a mirror. When peace becomes the default state, it rewires how a person evaluates everything else. Men who have stepped away from chaotic dynamics are no longer comparing one stressful situation to another. They are comparing stress to calm, noise to quiet, obligation to choice. That comparison is unforgiving. Once someone experiences a life where their time is respected, where their resources are not assumed to be communal property, and where their presence is not treated as a utility, it becomes impossible to pretend that the old way was normal or healthy. This is why so many conversations about men returning to dating miss the point entirely. They assume men left because they were unhappy and that happiness can be restored with minor adjustments. But men did not leave because they were unhappy in general. They left because they were unhappy in very specific, repeatable ways. Those patterns did not require explanation. They required exit. Men did not need theory to justify leaving. They needed relief. What replaced that old structure was not emptiness, but ownership. Ownership of schedule, ownership of finances, ownership of emotional bandwidth. Men stopped explaining themselves and started organizing their lives. They built routines that served them instead of draining them. They chose environments where expectations were clear and outcomes were predictable. Over time, that structure created a sense of internal stability that no external validation could match. One of the most misunderstood aspects of this shift is the idea that men are becoming antisocial or disconnected. In reality, men are becoming more selective. They are choosing interactions that add value rather than subtract energy. Friendships that involve shared effort survive. Ones built on constant crisis do not. Communities centered around skill building, shared goals, or mutual interests flourish. Spaces built on emotional volatility slowly empty. This selectivity extends beyond dating into every aspect of life. Men are reassessing workplaces, social circles, and obligations that no longer make sense. The same pattern recognition that led them to walk away from unbalanced relationships now applies everywhere. If effort is consistently punished and boundaries are ignored, participation ends. This is not rebellion, it is optimization. Another factor driving this permanence is the collapse of trust in institutions that were supposed to offer fairness. Many men observed systems that enforced responsibility without protection. They saw consequences applied unevenly and accountability applied selectively. Over time, that observation eroded belief in the idea that participation guaranteed stability. Men adapted by reducing exposure. They simplified their lives, minimized risk, and focused on things they could control directly. That simplification is often mistaken for regression, but it is the opposite. Complexity without benefit is not progress. Men are not rejecting advancement, they are rejecting unnecessary complication. A smaller circle, a quieter life, and fewer entanglements do not indicate defeat, they indicate discernment. As this discernment spreads, the cultural narrative struggles to keep up. Old scripts assume male participation as a given. They assume men will absorb inconvenience to maintain harmony. When that assumption fails, confusion follows. People search for explanations that preserve the old framework rather than updating it. That is why so many reactions frame men as broken rather than changed. But men are not broken, they are recalibrated. They have adjusted their expectations to match reality. They no longer believe promises without evidence. They no longer accept blame without cause. They no longer invest where returns are consistently negative. These are rational behaviors in any other context. They only seem radical because they are applied to areas once considered exempt from scrutiny. This recalibration also affects how men view risk. In the past, risk was framed as necessary for growth. Men were encouraged to take emotional and financial risks with little protection. Now, risk is evaluated more carefully. Men ask what happens if things go wrong, not just what happens if they go right. That question changes decisions dramatically. It also changes attraction dynamics. When men are no longer desperate, they are no longer easily influenced by surface level incentives. Confidence built on self sufficiency is not swayed by status symbols or performative validation. Men who have built stable lives are not impressed by noise. They value consistency, honesty, and peace. Anything that threatens those values is quietly excluded. This is why attempts to label men as missing out fall flat. Missing out only applies when the alternative is better. For men who have found contentment, the idea that they are missing something feels disconnected from their lived experience. They are not waiting, they are living. The long term implications of the shift extend into future generations. Younger men, observing older men, choosing peace, internalize that model. They see that life does not collapse without constant pursuit. And two, they learn that fulfillment does not require endless compromise. This changes how they approach adulthood, relationships, and responsibility. They are less likely to accept roles that demand sacrifice without respect. This generational transmission is subtle but powerful. It does not require instruction. It happens through observation. Boys notice which men are calm and which are constantly stressed. They notice who controls their time and who is controlled by it. They draw conclusions accordingly. Over time, those conclusions shape behavior at scale. Another important consequence of the shift is the decline of performative masculinity. When men stop performing for approval, they stop exaggerating toughness or dominance. Strength becomes quieter and more practical. Masculinity becomes functional rather than theatrical. This reduces conflict rather than increasing it. Men who are secure do not need to prove anything. This functional masculinity prioritizes health, competence, and self control. It values preparation over bravado. Men lift weights not to impress, but to feel capable. They learn skills not to signal status, but to increase independence. They manage finances not to dominate, but to protect themselves. These behaviors are not reactions, they are foundations. As these foundations solidify, men become less responsive to emotional manipulation. Appeals to guilt, fear, or nostalgia lose effectiveness. Men recognize those tactics because they have experienced them before. Once recognized, they no longer provoke reaction. Silence replaces argument. Distance replaces engagement. That pattern repeats consistently. The result is a cultural standoff where one side expects reaction and the other side offers none. That silence is interpreted as hostility, but it is not. It is disengagement. And disengagement is difficult to counter because it does not provide leverage. This is also why calls for men to return often sound hollow. They focus on what men should do rather than why men left. They appeal to duty without addressing incentive. They demand participation without offering change. Men hear those messages and compare them to their current lives. The comparison does not favor return. Another aspect rarely discussed is how this shift affects men emotionally. Contrary to stereotypes, many men report feeling lighter, not lonelier. Without constant tension, emotional regulation improves. Men become more patient, more reflective, and less reactive. They have space to process experiences instead of constantly managing conflict. That emotional stability reinforces their choices. Men also rediscover curiosity. Without pressure to conform to scripts, they explore interest freely. Learning becomes enjoyable again. Creativity returns. Play becomes legitimate rather than childish. This richness is not easily surrendered for the sake of fitting into outdated expectations. Critics often claim this lifestyle is unsustainable or empty, but that claim ignores evidence. Men are sustaining it daily. They are not withdrawing from life, they are designing it intentionally. That intentionality is the difference. As society adjusts to this new reality, there will be attempts to reframe the narrative. Some will try to portray men as obligated to fix broader social problems. Others will argue that men owe participation for the sake of balance. Those arguments assume ownership over men's choices. That assumption no longer holds. Men are not obligated to sacrifice themselves to maintain systems that do not serve them. Cooperation requires mutual benefit. When benefit disappears, so does cooperation. That is not cruelty. That is reality. The question moving forward is not whether men will return, it is whether systems will adapt. Adaptation requires accountability on all sides. It requires recognizing contributions that were invisible until they stopped. It requires redefining partnership as shared effort rather than assumed provision. If that adaptation does not happen, the trend will continue. Men will further refine their boundaries. They will invest more deeply in their own stability. They will build parallel lives that function independently of traditional structures. Those lives will not be flashy, but they will be resilient. Resilience is the defining feature of this movement. Not anger, not resentment, resilience. Men are preparing for uncertainty by reducing dependency. They are building lives that can withstand volatility. In a changing world, that approach is rational. This is why attempts to shame men back into participation are not only ineffective, but counterproductive. They confirm the very patterns men chose to leave. Pressure reinforces withdrawal. Respect invites engagement. The choice is clear, even if it is uncomfortable to acknowledge. As this conversation continues, it becomes evident that the shift we are witnessing is not about gender conflict, it is about individual agency. Men are exercising agency in ways that were previously discouraged. Once exercised, agency is rarely surrendered. The silence many interpret as abandonment is actually self determination. Men are no longer asking for permission to live well, they are doing it. And that brings us to an unavoidable conclusion. When people learn that they can build peace without approval, approval loses its power. When people learn that their presence is optional, they stop tolerating environments that treat them as expendable. This is not the end of society. It is a reorganization of priorities. Those who adapt will thrive. Those who cling to old assumptions will struggle. That outcome is not moral, it is practical. As expectations shift, one of the most revealing developments is how differently men now define success. For a long time, success was framed externally. Status, approval, social validation, and relationship milestones were treated as proof of progress. Men were encouraged to measure themselves by what they could provide to others rather than what they could sustain for themselves. That framework quietly collapsed once men began asking a simple question: does this life actually feel stable? When the answer was no, the old metrics lost credibility. Men began redefining success as sustainability. A successful life became one that could be maintained without constant stress, without financial overextension, and without emotional volatility. Stability replaced spectacle. Consistency replaced intensity. This reframing is subtle, but it fundamentally alters behavior. When success is defined internally, external pressure loses influence. This is also why so many attempts to reframe men as failing fall flat. Failure only exists relative to a goal. Men change the goal. When the objective becomes peace, autonomy, and self respect, opting out of dysfunctional systems looks less like failure and more like alignment. Critics can argue definitions endlessly, but lived experience carries more weight than commentary. Another important element of this shift is how men now view responsibility. Responsibility used to mean absorbing consequences regardless of origin. Men were expected to take accountability even when they had limited authority or input. Over time, that imbalance became impossible to ignore. Men now differentiate between responsibility they choose and responsibility imposed without consent. Chosen responsibility is embraced. Imposed responsibility is declined. This distinction explains much of the withdrawal we are seeing. Men are not avoiding responsibility altogether. They are avoiding responsibility without agency. They are willing to build, protect, and maintain what they control. They are no longer willing to be accountable for outcomes shaped by forces they are not allowed to influence. That boundary is firm and it is rational. As men adopt this mindset, their tolerance for ambiguity decreases. Vague expectations, shifting rules, and unspoken obligations are identified as risk factors. Men prefer clarity now, clear roles, clear boundaries, clear consequences. If clarity is absent, participation is reduced. This preference for clarity is not rigidity, it is risk management. Risk management has become central to how men navigate the modern world. Economic uncertainty, legal complexity, and social volatility all contribute to a heightened awareness of downside risk. Men respond by simplifying. They limit exposure. They avoid entanglements that carry disproportionate consequences. This is not pessimism, it is realism. The result is a quieter but more deliberate form of masculinity. Men are not trying to dominate environments, they are trying to navigate them safely. They are not seeking control over others, they are seeking control over themselves. That internal locus of control changes everything. This change also alters how men respond to conflict. Instead of escalating or engaging, they disengage. Conflict is evaluated for its cost rather than its emotional charge. If the cost outweighs the benefit, men walk away. This behavior is often misinterpreted as avoidance, but it is actually discernment. Not every battle deserves attention. The withdrawal from constant conflict creates space for reflection. Men have time to think, to evaluate, and to plan. They are no longer reacting impulsively to social pressure. They are responding intentionally to circumstances. That shift from reaction to response is one of the most significant developments of this era. It is also why attempts to provoke men into engagement fail. Provocation relies on emotional investment. Men who have disengaged are no longer invested in proving anything. Insults bounce off indifference. Criticism loses its sting when it comes from standards no longer accepted. Another consequence of the shift is the breakdown of performative outrage. Men are no longer compelled to participate in public debates that offer no resolution. They do not feel the need to signal virtue or allegiance. Silence becomes a strategy. Not because men lack opinions, but because they recognize when expression is futile. This strategic silence frustrates systems that depend on reaction. When people stop reacting, narratives lose momentum. When momentum stalls, influence fades. Men did not need to organize to create this effect. They simply stopped playing their assigned roles. This is also why many men feel a sense of relief rather than loss. The constant demand to perform, to justify, and to explain is exhausting. Stepping away from that demand restores energy. That energy is then invested elsewhere. Health improves, focus sharpens, goals become achievable. Men also rediscover competence through solitude. When you rely on yourself, you develop skills out of necessity. Men learn to manage finances, maintain living spaces, cook, exercise, and structure their time effectively. This competence builds confidence that is grounded, not performative. Confidence built this way does not seek approval. This grounded confidence reshapes how men interact with the world. They are less reactive, less defensive, and less eager to impress. They do not need to win arguments to feel secure. They do not need validation to feel worthy. Their sense of self is anchored internally. As more men adopt this orientation, social dynamics shift. Interactions become more transactional where clarity is required and more genuine where trust exists. Men are no longer willing to blur boundaries for the sake of harmony. They prefer honest distance over forced closeness. This preference challenges long-standing norms that equated closeness with virtue. Men are learning that proximity without respect is not connection. Distance with clarity is healthier than intimacy with chaos. This realization recalibrates social expectations across the board. The impact of this recalibration extends into how men view partnership. Partnership is no longer assumed to be a default goal. It is an option evaluated against an existing baseline of peace. If partnership enhances that baseline, it is considered. If it threatens it, it is declined. This is not fear of commitment, it is respect for stability. This shift also exposes how many narratives relied on men lacking alternatives. When men develop fulfilling lives independently, those narratives lose leverage. Men are no longer negotiating from scarcity, they are negotiating from sufficiency. That changes power dynamics fundamentally. Power dynamics become more balanced when neither side is desperate. Desperation creates imbalance. Sufficiency creates choice. Men choosing sufficiency remove themselves from cycles that thrive on imbalance. This is not a political statement, it is a personal one, repeated at scale. As these personal decisions accumulate, cultural structures adapt slowly. Some institutions will adjust, others will resist. Resistance often manifests as blame rather than reflection. Blame feels easier than change, but blame does not restore participation, it accelerates disengagement. Men recognize this pattern quickly. When faced with blame, they retreat further. When faced with respect, they may reconsider. Respect requires acknowledging boundaries and contributions. Without that acknowledgement, there is no incentive to return. This brings us to an uncomfortable truth. Many systems depended on men's unacknowledged labor, attention, and restraint. Once withdrawn, the cost. The assistant stopped mid-sentence due to length limits. Many systems depended on men's unacknowledged labor, attention, and restraint. Once withdrawn, the cost of that absence became visible in ways that could no longer be ignored. What had once been quietly absorbed now surfaced as friction, confusion, and unmet expectations. The response to this visibility has often been emotional rather than analytical. But emotion does not rebuild foundations. Recognition does. Men are not demanding praise or gratitude, they are responding to incentives. Incentives do not have to be financial, they can be respect, fairness, clarity, and reciprocity. When those elements are missing, participation becomes irrational. Men have learned this through experience, not ideology. Experience is persuasive because it cannot be argued away. One of the clearest signs of the shift is how men now handle boundaries. In the past, boundaries were flexible, negotiable, and often ignored in the name of harmony. Men tolerated discomfort to avoid conflict. That tolerance is gone. Boundaries are now communicated through action rather than explanation. Men leave environments that cross them. They do not stay to negotiate endlessly. They do not justify themselves. They simply disengage. This behavioral clarity is often misread as coldness, but it is actually precision. Men have learned that prolonged negotiation often benefits the party least willing to compromise. By exiting early, men conserve energy and reduce exposure to risk. This is not emotional withdrawal, it is strategic withdrawal. Another important aspect of this transformation is how men now interpret effort. Effort used to be framed as inherently virtuous. The more a man sacrificed, the more moral credit he was assumed to have earned. But moral credit did not translate into security or appreciation. Men noticed this discrepancy. Now, effort is evaluated based on outcome. If effort produces instability, it is reduced. If effort produces growth, it is maintained. This outcome based approach reshapes priorities. Men invest more time in activities with clear feedback loops. Physical training, skill acquisition, financial planning, and creative work all provide measurable progress. These activities reward consistency and discipline. In contrast, environments with vague expectations and shifting standards feel unproductive. Men gravitate toward what works. This gravitation creates a feedback loop. As men invest more in self directed pursuits, their competence increases. Increased competence reduces dependency. Reduced dependency increases choice. Choice reinforces confidence. That confidence further reduces tolerance for imbalance. Over time, this loop becomes self sustaining. It is also important to note that men are not rejecting empathy or connection. They are rejecting asymmetry. They are willing to show care where care is mutual. They are willing to support where support flows both ways. What they no longer accept is being the default provider of emotional stability while their own needs are minimized or dismissed. This rejection of asymmetry has broad implications. It challenges long-standing expectations around emotional labor. Men are no longer willing to be the silent regulators of mood and conflict. They expect shared responsibility for emotional climate. When that responsibility is not shared, they step away. The stepping away is often quiet, which makes it easy to underestimate its significance. But quiet changes are often the most durable. They do not provoke immediate backlash because they do not announce themselves. They simply alter participation rates over time. Eventually, the cumulative effect becomes undeniable. This is why conversations about restoring balance often feel disconnected from reality. They focus on persuading men rather than understanding them. They emphasize messaging rather than structure. Men are not responding to messaging anymore. They are responding to lived experience. Structural change matters more than narrative change. Men have also become more comfortable with the idea that not every problem is theirs to solve. In the past, men were often positioned as fixers by default. When something went wrong, they were expected to step in. That expectation was rarely reciprocated. Men now evaluate whether intervention is appropriate or beneficial. If not, they abstain. This abstention is sometimes interpreted as apathy, but it is better understood as selectivity. Men still care. They just care shamdo where their involvement makes sense. Caring without agency leads to frustration. Men have learned to avoid that trap. As a result, men's emotional lives are becoming more stable. Without constant exposure to conflict and criticism, stress levels decrease. Sleep improves. Focus improves. Health improves. These improvements reinforce the decision to remain disengaged from chaotic environments. Well-being becomes evidence. This evidence is difficult to counter with argument. When someone feels better, performs better, and lives more calmly, telling them they are wrong rings hollow. Men trust their bodies and routines more than opinions. Another factor contributing to the permanence of this shift is how men now view time. Time is no longer something to be filled with obligation. It is something to be protected. Men are acutely aware of how quickly time passes and how little of it is recoverable. They choose to spend it deliberately. Deliberate time use means fewer forced interactions and more intentional ones. Men are comfortable with fewer relationships if those relationships are higher quality. Quantity no longer impresses. Depth matters more than breadth. This preference for depth also changes how men communicate. They are less verbose, less reactive, and more measured. They speak when they have something to say. They listen more than they argue. This communication style is efficient and reduces misunderstanding. It also reduces susceptibility to manipulation. Manipulation thrives on emotional volatility and urgency. Calm, deliberate individuals are harder to manipulate. Men who have cultivated this calm are less responsive to pressure tactics. They pause before responding. That pause is powerful. As more men adopt this posture, social dynamics shift subtly, interactions slow down, expectations recalibrate. Some people adapt to this new rhythm, others resist it. Resistance often takes the form of escalation, but escalation without engagement loses effectiveness quickly. Men have also learned that walking away is not abandonment, it is boundary enforcement. Abandonment implies obligation. Men no longer accept obligations they did not choose. This reframing is liberating. It allows men to disengage without guilt. Guilt was one of the primary mechanisms that kept men participating in unfavorable arrangements. Once guilt loses its grip, behavior changes rapidly. Men no longer feel compelled to justify their choices to those who do not share their values. This value alignment is critical. Men are not antisocial, they are values driven. They seek environments where expectations align with principles. When alignment exists, men invest deeply. When it does not, they withdraw completely. The result is a bifurcation of experiences. Some spaces become more functional and cooperative, others deteriorate as participation drops. This is not intentional sabotage, it is the natural outcome of choice. Choice is the central theme of this era. Men are exercising choice in ways that were previously discouraged or ridiculed. Once exercised, choice becomes habit. Habits become identity. Identity becomes destiny. This is why reversal is unlikely. Even if external conditions improve marginally, the internal shift remains. Men have tasted autonomy, they have built lives around it. Returning to dependency would require unlearning lessons that were hard won. As this movement continues, its visibility will increase. Not because men are making noise, but because outcomes will diverge. Men who prioritize stability will continue to function well. Systems that rely on assumption rather than incentive will continue to strain. The gap between expectation and reality will widen. That gap creates discomfort, but it also creates opportunity. Those willing to adapt can rebuild trust. Those unwilling will continue to lose participation. Trust is the currency that has been depleted. Rebuilding it requires consistency over time, not rhetoric. Men are watching closely. They are patient, but they are not forgetful. This patience is another misunderstood trait. Men are not rushing to judgment, they are observing patterns. Observation takes time. Patterns reveal themselves slowly. Once revealed, decisions follow. This measured approach stands in contrast to reaction driven culture. Men are no longer participating in cycles of outrage and apology. They prefer stability to spectacle. This preference shapes every decision they make. As the landscape continues to evolve, one truth remains constant. Men are not returning to roles that cost them peace. Any future structure that ignores that reality will fail to attract participation. Peace is not a luxury, it is a requirement. Men have learned that lesson deeply. It informs how they work, how they socialize, and how they live. If there is one mistake people continue to make when trying to understand this shift, it is assuming that the future will resemble the past with minor adjustments. That assumption ignores the internal changes that have already taken place. Men did not merely step away from dating or traditional expectations, they restructured their lives around principles that make sense to them. Once a structure is rebuilt from the inside out, cosmetic changes on the surface do not matter. Any future form of partnership, connection, or cooperation will only exist if it aligns with that new internal framework. Men are no longer entering arrangements hoping they will improve over time. They expect clarity at the beginning. They expect consistency throughout. They expect accountability on both sides. Without those elements, there is no incentive to proceed. Sustainable partnership in this new context looks very different from what many people imagine. It is not based on sacrifice as virtue or endurance as proof of commitment. It is based on mutual independence. Two people choosing to share life without needing to be rescued from it. Two people capable of standing alone who decide that walking together enhances rather than diminishes their stability. This kind of partnership does not rely on pressure, guilt, or obligation. It relies on alignment, shared values, shared expectations, clear boundaries, mutual respect. These are not romantic abstractions. They are practical requirements. Without them, peace is disrupted, and men will not trade peace for nostalgia. Men are not rejecting the idea of companionship. They are rejecting the assumption that companionship must come with imbalance. They are rejecting narratives that frame sacrifice as love while ignoring reciprocity. They are rejecting roles that require constant self suppression to maintain harmony. The reality is that many men now see partnership as optional rather than essential. That does not make them cold or closed, it makes them discerning. When something is optional, it must compete with the existing baseline. And that baseline is peace. Peace is waking up without anxiety. Peace is knowing your finances are stable. Peace is controlling your time. Peace is not having to explain yourself repeatedly. Peace is living without constant emotional negotiation. Anything that threatens this baseline must offer something of equal or greater value. Very few things do. This is why so many men appear unmoved by arguments appealing to loneliness or fear of the future. They are not operating from fear. They are operating from experience. They know what chaos feels like. They know what imbalance feels like. They know what it costs, and they know what peace feels like now. That comparison settles the matter. Another misunderstanding is the belief that men are waiting for conditions to improve. They are not waiting, they are living. Waiting implies dissatisfaction. Most men who have stepped away report the opposite. They are more focused, more rested, and more content than they have been in years. They are not counting days. They are building routines. These routines are not glamorous, but they are effective. Work, exercise, learning, rest, and personal interest create a rhythm that is sustainable. Men find pride in competence rather than approval. They measure progress in tangible ways rather than the emotional highs. This grounded approach reduces volatility and increases resilience. Resilience is the key word here. The world is becoming less predictable. Economic pressures, technological change, and social instability are increasing. In that environment, resilience matters more than image. Men are adapting accordingly. They are building lives that can withstand disruption rather than ones that depend on constant validation. This adaptation is not loud. It does not trend easily. It does not generate spectacle, but it endures. Quiet systems built on discipline always outlast noisy systems built on assumption. Men understand this intuitively because they live it daily. As this reality becomes more widespread, the conversation around men will continue to lag behind behavior. Commentary will trail action, analysis will trail lived experience. This gap creates confusion for those who rely on narratives rather than observation. But men are no longer persuaded by commentary, they are persuaded by results. When results are clear, men who prioritize peace perform better. They are healthier. They are more stable. They are less reactive. They are less stressed. These outcomes reinforce behavior. Reinforced behavior becomes culture. Culture does not change through argument alone, it changes through repetition. Millions of men making the same quiet choice every day creates a pattern. That pattern becomes the new normal, whether it is acknowledged or not. Attempts to reverse this pattern without addressing its root causes will fail. You cannot shame people out of a state that improves their lives. You cannot guilt people into chaos once they have experienced calm. You cannot pressure people into sacrifice when sacrifice no longer aligns with their values. If connection is to exist in the future, it will be on different terms. It will be voluntary, it will be reciprocal, it will respect autonomy, it will not demand self erasure. These conditions are not negotiable because they protect peace. Men are not asking for perfection, they are asking for balance. They are not asking to be placed above anyone else. They are asking not to be placed beneath expectations they did not agree to. This is a reasonable position, even if it is uncomfortable to confront. The discomfort many feel comes from the realization that certain assumptions no longer hold. Assumptions about who will step in, who will pay, who will absorb consequences, who will tolerate imbalance. When those assumptions collapse, responsibility becomes visible. Visibility is uncomfortable because it removes illusions. But illusions cannot sustain systems, only reality can. Men are choosing reality even when it is inconvenient. There is no dramatic ending to this story, no sudden resolution, no grand reconciliation. There is only continuation. Men continuing to choose peace, men continuing to invest in themselves, men continuing to disengage from systems that do not serve them. This is not a threat. It is not a warning. It is an observation. What people do with that observation is up to them. If anything is to change, it will require humility rather than accusation. It will require listening rather than lecturing. It will require understanding rather than demanding. Whether that happens remains to be seen. For now, the trajectory is clear. Men are walking their own paths. They are no longer waiting to be told where they belong. They are building lives that make sense to them. They are protecting what they have earned. And as this video comes to a close, the most important question is not what men should do next, but what you think about what has been discussed. Do you agree with what you are seeing in the world around you? Do these patterns match your own observations? Leave a comment below and share your thoughts because this conversation is far bigger than one video. Like the video if you like it. Don't forget to subscribe. And if you like the video, share the video. And just remember that all roads lead to MWA, men walking away, and cheers.
Nothing says you care like crypto. Nothing can compare. Nothing says you care like crypto. Oh, nothing can compare to crypto.